Welcome, everyone. I know we're just waiting for a few more people to join us and waiting for Dr. McGee to come online as well here. I just see he's joined us. See if we're quite ready for quorum here real quick.
I don't know if some people are having trouble logging in.
All right, Dr. McGee, it looks like we should have reached critical mass. I think we can call for quorum if you're ready.
Okay, why don't we go ahead and just move forward. Welcome everyone to the January 2026 OPTN board meeting. Hope everyone had a good holiday and Happy New Year. Next slide. So the first action of a business is calling for a quorum.
And the quorum link has been posted to the chat. So please, board members, if you would please click onto that link and acknowledge your presence. And once I get the thumbs up, we can get started.
Doug, maybe it's just me, but link is not opening for me.
All right, Alan, we'll look into that. We do have quorum though, so we'll look into that, Alan, and we'll acknowledge that you are present and get moving.
Thank you.
Great. Okay, moving. So we have quorum. Thank you. The first item, just as a reminder, that this work group, the agenda for today's meeting, the call to order and the quorum. We're going to first vote on the meeting summary from our previous meeting. That'll be an action item vote. We're then going to hear an update from the AOS work groups led by Justin Wilkerson, which will be the first presentation to the in-depth presentation of a lot of this work to the board. It's informational and kind of sets the stage for developing next steps. We're going to get an update from Brianna on the modernization activities and we'll talk about a little bit about the bridge period here, some updates from the OPTN, myself, and then we will go into closed session with an MPSC report to the board. So next item. So the next item is approval of the meeting summary, which was in the meeting materials provided to the board from our December 12th board meeting. Next slide. So there's a resolution to approve these minutes or these summaries as written. Can I have a motion to support this?
So moved.
Great. Second. Thanks, Sam. Okay, we a second. Any further discussion, questions, concerns? Okay, hearing none, we'll go ahead and vote on this.
The voting link has been added to the chat, so I ask board members to please click that link.
All right. The link isn't working on my end either, so I vote to approve.
Okay, let me.
I've got it working, but it's opening in Firefox for some reason.
Pass the team into that. The motion has 24 approved, 0 reject. I'm sorry, 27 approved, 0 rejections, 0. Thank you.
Okay, great. So the next item is we're going to hear from Justin Wilkerson and the other team leads for the allocation out of sequence. Just to remind the board again, we've heard several updates on this over the past 6 months. As you'll recall, kind of at the beginning of July, first couple months of our terms, there was a request or a directive from HRSA to look at allocation out of sequence. It's important to remember that allocation out of sequence reflects deviation from policy, and the OPTN's job is to develop policy. So while components of allocation out of sequence might be made to facilitate placement of difficult to place organs, the policy needs to reflect that. And so we can follow it and monitor and make it be available to anyone to see how the system works. This phenomena, allocation out of sequence, clearly started increasing in 2022 across all organ groups. It really reached a plateau in 2024. It's gone down somewhat with increased attention, but it has not reached a baseline. And we need to put in policy to make sure we maintain it and not have significant allocation out of sequence. So the work group was charged with addressing these things. You're going to hear a presentation now about the first product to come from them, reflects a pen to paper effort. And it will be refined as it goes forward. So, and then anything that derives from this will be formally developed into a policy proposal and go through all the steps that it normally would be with input from the committees, public comment, and approval by the board. But so this is a first view of it. So Justin, take it away.
Hey, thank you, John. Appreciate the intro. Next slide, please. Here's our agenda. We're going to talk about essentially 4 projects that we have that I'm excited to present. And also Kevin Lee is going to present one of his projects. Next slide, please. First, I want to do a few thank yous to the team leads. Kevin Lee and Dr. Stephen Potter both been, not only, I think work towards a sound solutions to their problems, but also provided really good leadership of their work groups and got the most out of those groups. So thank you very much to the 2 of them. I'd also like to thank the board officers. They were involved in most of the meetings throughout this process, giving input and guidance to us. And HRSA, in particular, Dr. Sarah Lasky and her data team were integral to the work we've done. AIR's provided a lot of support, specifically Taylor Melanson, who was assigned directly to us and really worked hard to help us develop these products. And then a special thanks to the MPSC, and in particular, I'd like to thank Dr. Cliff Miles, who was kind of all over the place in all these meetings and given his input to all the projects. Next slide. These are our members, a lot of really, really highly qualified folks with a strong input, great ideas, great feedback, and connection with the groups. They come from us across the spectrum, from members and volunteers. We've got OPO representation, providers, transplant administrators, and patients throughout all 3 of these teams. Next slide. Okay, a little bit of background now on these projects. So we had the charge, which was to mitigate allocation out of sequence. I think with these projects, if they're accepted and implemented properly, they have the potential to go deeper, though, than allocation out of sequence, I think, what you'll see. And would like to reiterate, which John had already said, that this is kind of the end of the beginning. These are just draft proposals that now have to go through a review process, through OPTN leadership, the HRSA legal team, and then into initial development following that, if they're accepted. Next slide. Okay, Dr. Potter couldn't make it today, so I'm going to brief his team's work. Next slide. I think what it does. The first thing we need to do when we talk about what the offer team was doing is why they were doing it. And being a patient myself and not a provider or involved in administration of transplant or OPO, I didn't understand at first why we needed to define an offer. And it became clear quickly when we moved into it. So, in asking that question, why didn't we need to define an offer? It's essentially because there was no good operational definition of what an organ offer is. Therefore, it wasn't recordable, auditable, and you could kind of see this in a lot of ways where things are considered offers. Is it electronic? Is it a phone call? Is it a text between an OPO and a center? And to kind of illustrate why this has become an issue, I'll read the current best definition that we have for offer, which is in OPTN policy 5.4.B.3. And it provides the only a partial definition. It doesn't clearly define it. And I'll quote some of it and paraphrase a bit. OPOs must first offer organs to potential transplant recipients in the order that they appear on the match run. Now that seems like a fine definition, but it doesn't define how you make an offer, how it's recorded, and therefore the point we've gotten to is it's not terribly auditable at this point. So that's what this team did. So if you talk about what's the nexus with allocation out of sequence, it's because if we're not recording who all is getting offers, because some of them are kind of happening behind the scenes, then we don't understand who had an offer and why it was declined. And more frankly, what actually allocation out of sequence is. Next slide, please. So the work to date that Steve and his team did, they've held multiple sessions and talked to a lot of stakeholders, received input from their team members, from some outside volunteers, from HRSA, from board leadership. And so they looked at the current policy and tried to build upon it to identify good language for an operational definition. So they wanted to do a practice that allowed effective organ allocation with the, so it used current policy, but it's going to have to alter some of the current policy. And I'll talk about that here in a second. So, but the first thing they decided they needed to do was define a minimum viable data set for the offer. So, some of this is obvious, donor ID, age, sex, height, some of the testing results. And then they wanted to develop a plain language offer and what the kind of limit of the definitions would be to provide a holistic, understandable, and recordable definition of an offer. Next slide, please. So now they've got to what they call a plain language definition of an offer, and I'll just read it verbatim. An organ offer is a formal, verifiable communication from an OPO to a transplant hospital for one or more specific potential transplant recipients, indicating the availability of a specific organ in the allocation order specified on the match run. An order must be transmitted electronically through formal OPTN channels and must be time-stamped. I'm going to read a few other criteria that are on the document that they wrote for it. So for a valid organ offer, it needs to be generated electronically through the OPTN system. It needs to include all data for the match run that are available at the time of offer notification. It needs to refer to a specific offer donor and is referred to a specific patient. It is time-stamped and traceable, and if it's missing these, it's outside the OPTN system and it's an invalid offer. So that's the work they did. And, it's important to do this because now I think if once we get to and also I guess I should say, these aren't finished. This definition is not finished. This is what they came up with, and they worked hard to do this, but there's going to be other proposals as we work through this, and it's going to be refined, kind of what the meets the requirements for an offer. And you can see down there it says policies, which need some relevant language, and there's various OPTN policies and definitions that'll have to be adjusted to meet the requirements of an offer. So that is the current status of offer, and I'll talk a little bit more about it broadly at the end. I'm now going to turn it over to Kevin Lee to discuss his expedited kidney placement.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to review these draft proposals as part of the iterative process moving forward. Echo all the thanks that Justin issued to many individuals who have volunteered countless hours in addition to their day jobs. With that, let's move on to the next slide, please. Yeah, so we were looking at developing a national policy to standardize expedited placement for kidneys that are at risk of non-use or allocation out of sequence. We wanted to ensure that it's a fair process, that it is accountable and auditable with safeguards for reliable data collection. As Justin referenced, and many of us are well aware that in the current environment, there are many offers that are going outside of the match run. They're violating OPTN policy, and they are not recorded within the donor net system at any level because that doesn't exist today. And so we're not even sure of the scope of how many offers are taking place on a daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly basis in allocation out of sequence. So it's got to be transparent. We've got to work towards those goals. And And the team really took that to heart. Next slide. Yeah, so one of the things you're going to see is our first recommendation regarding eligibility criteria for organs and candidates. We are continuing to work on how we standardize one process across all 55 organ procurement organizations so that there is standard work in this area and that the policy clearly outlines the responsibilities of both the organ procurement organization and the center that is accepting that offer for the patient within the match run. Give you a moment there just to read through those remaining bullet points. If I could have the next slide, please. Yeah, so here is where the team spent a significant amount of time looking at how to create criteria that really address the issues in a meaningful way. A lot of work was done, and we just echo Justin's thanks for many of you who joined these calls and continue to provide pragmatic input and approaches moving forward. So we are looking at a minimal CIT and a minimal number of refusals by patients within the match run. And you can see that there in that second bullet point. That is the entry point into this criteria. And then at least one of the following criteria need to be met for that kidney to be placed in an expedited placement pathway moving forward. Next slide. So this is the draft proposal about how we create a standardized process. You can see that we're highlighting or emphasizing the need to first offer those to priority patients using expedited placement, and the subset is below there. And we're working to, once we've reached that 6 hours of cold time and there have been 30 patient declines within the match run, to develop a process which allows an offer to several patients at different transplant centers at the same time using a fair, efficient process. And you can see that we're going to need to continue to work on this. This is not the end, it's just the beginning. And we want to also emphasize to the larger OPTN and to the community as a whole that this is a dynamic policy process that will need to be evaluated on regular intervals to ensure it meets patient needs and is meeting our goals of transparency, accountability, and auditability. Next slide. And with that, I will pass the baton back to Justin.
Hey, thank you, Kevin. Appreciate your hard work, dedication to this, and your team's work. And I do want to take a step back for a moment because when we get into the compliance work we're doing, there's especially a part that really fits into expedited placement. And I think part of the work that Kevin's team is doing, they focus on expedited placement of kidneys because obviously that's the largest share of allocation out of sequence in the OPTN amongst OPTN members. But they're trailblazing the way for other organs too. It's not a perfect solution for all, but it's establishing a system or a way to provide an expedited pathway, which is so important to be able to get those challenging organs that aren't matched early in the match run and quickly. And as they accrue that cold ischemic time, they are at risk of loss. So that's currently why they're falling into allocation out of sequence. And so I think the work they're doing is going to provide examples of how to solve it for other organs too, whether it's livers or hearts and whatnot. Next slide, please. Okay, so I ran the compliance team along with being the overall chair. And so we had goals from the beginning to evaluate member compliance in the aggregate, meaning they're looking at OPOs and the members in their regions, to routinely audit member compliance or establish a system to do member auditing, and then to educate members. So I'll talk about all those more specifically, and then we're going to get into the two projects that came out of the work for this. And I will say the goals for this team were a bit more opaque maybe than the other two groups that had specific tasks. And because of that, we spent a lot of time understanding the problem, getting briefings from various partners in the members in the system, and then kind of came up with a series of projects and then boiled that down to these two projects. There are others that we're going to record and maybe at some point it'll be undertaken, but for now, these are the two projects. Next slide, please. I kind of just briefed this slide just a moment ago, but we did, like I say, extensive review of OPO data. And I would like to say there are new, given kind of technology and the HRSA data team, there's a lot of new robust reports that are out there that really will help enable an auditing system to be developed nowadays. And then we also held, like I said, we had input from multiple stakeholders. We had several presentations from OPOs on best practices. That was very helpful in the work we've done. And then we targeted a few key areas for compliance. So I'll break this down into three. First, if you look at allocation out sequence, there are kind of two organs that fit into allocation out sequence. There are organs that probably should have gone earlier in the match run that could have been matched and weren't for whatever reason, right? So those are ones that we looked at and we said, well, that would be auditing and member education, OPO processes and practices at centers that we could look at for that. And then there's the organs that Kevin was talking about with his group, which are the more challenging organs to match that have, high KDPI. They're challenging. They've had high, it's called ischemic time. And so it becomes more and more untenable over time to match them, or they need to move further down the list to get matched to a suitable candidate. The smaller share of allocation out of sequence is obviously the ones that probably should have gone earlier in the sequence and could have, and for whatever reason didn't. They went to someone out of sequence. The large share of them are those more challenging organs that probably need to step into an expedited pathway to match up with a suitable candidate. And then the third piece we've done, which is the second project here, is the OPTN management oversight, member education, and operational practice sharing. This was a popular concept amongst members when it was briefed, especially the best practice information sharing amongst OPOs and some of the mentorship. A fairly popular concept amongst the folks that we had in the group that were from the OPOs and the MPSC. Next slide, please. The first project I'm going to talk about is concurrent organ acceptance time limits, and I'll explain how this process works. We looked at this as to that second group of allocation out sequence, that larger group, which is more challenging organs that it's difficult to quickly find a match. And as we're working, so understanding how this works, where currently we have a match run system that looks at every candidate individually and then moves to the next and then moves to the next. Now, obviously, individuals or groups of them could be bypassed if there's a filter, if they're filtered out for a no on that specific organ. However, one of the issues we have with allocation out sequence, especially with kidneys, is the pervasive use of provisional yes, or PY, in the UNET system. Essentially, PY is being used as a not no. So instead of, it says provisional yes, but I think it's a bit misleading. What it's really saying is the center says, well, I'm not going to discard the opportunity to look at this organ later on. So I believe there's kind of a variety of practices using PY where some are looking at it more deeply for that organ versus their candidates, and some that are much further down the list. Where they just put provisional yes, so they don't lose an opportunity to look at that. But the problem it causes a lot of noise in the system and a lot of PYs that eventually turn to no. And so we were looking at this project as a possibility for more quickly moving an organ down the allocation run to getting it to a suitable patient. So the proposal is that concurrent time that after an organ, in this case, we'll say a kidney because that's the current expedited pathway we're working on. After it enters an expedited pathway, so it comes off of the normal run into the expedited pathway, the question is, well, what happens once it is selected for expedited pathway? So once it goes into expedited pathway, one solution that could be used is this concurrent time organ acceptance times limits. This is based off the Eurotransplant the recipient oriented allocation, extended allocation model for kidneys. What happens is in this broad concept, once it enters this concurrent organ acceptance time limits, an OPO would have a certain number of centers and would have a certain number of patients at each of those centers that would be on a concurrent clock, let's say an hour, to make a decision for that patient. So that patient would get a firm decision at that patient. Once that hour ended, we would then have a set of patients that would be from the former match run in the same match amongst the ones that was selected as, yes, this organ is suitable for my patient. And let's say it's the top 3 or top 5, then that set of patients, the organ would be run to it until a suitable match was found and accepted, and that organ would be allocated. So the advantage of this system over the current system is instead of going in sequence one by one until there's a suitable candidate, which accrues cold ischemic time, this one would would be several or many would have to make a decision all concurrently. Now we believe this will meet NOTA and final rule will be compliant because it's not a firm offer going to multiple candidates. It's multiple centers making decisions that they would accept it for their candidates if and when offered. So I would look at my list and say, where would I accept this organ for my candidate? I get to sequence, let's say 100, and then I say, okay, I'm going to pick the next 5 candidates. I would accept it for all of them in the sequence. I select yes for all of them. Other centers are doing the same thing. Then that group is pulled and the organ is allocated according to that sequence. No, 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 and then yes, that organ is offered and accepted, and then goes to that particular patient. So that is, in a nutshell, the broad concept of the system. As I say on this slide, we have not, defined the center selection criteria, and we've discussed various ways you could do it, whether it's a certain number of centers, you look at them, are they regional? And obviously, the organ is accruing time when it gets to this point. It's already been rejected by multiple candidates. It's gone into an expedited pathway, and now time is of the essence. So that's why this system has an advantage in that it crunches everybody into one clock and then pulls out a series of people, and we could hopefully pass to the matching candidate quickly. It is still in a sequence. But the current selections under review, the concept broadly was very enthusiastically, thought by the folks on the group and outside people that were attending the meetings. And then we had talked about, if we move through this and this, we could pilot it with kidneys first, obviously, because you would need an expedited pathway to utilize this system, but it could be theoretically utilized for other organs and not just kidneys once they have their own expedited pathways. And then some of the considerations for this project would be, of course, you have to have an expedited pathway to go into this system already established. It would be an increased workload for OPTN members, as they would have to evaluate more thoroughly multiple candidates kind of concurrently and work through those, and probably calls to some of those candidates as it gets closer. There would obviously have to be UNET updates to be able to, sort this out, to the logistics of it, and pull that kind of updated list. And then there would need to be some policy updates to make this compliant. Next slide, please. And now the other project that we worked on in the compliance group, which is also the one in the HRSA directive to audit and educate members, was the member auditing mentorship oversight and intervention program. Currently, there is no formal member auditing program, and there was some discussion about this. The closest we have is programs that the MPSC currently does. So the MPSC does have programs where they go visit members to evaluate them. They do view reports that are sent to members, I believe, biannually. There's a biannual report that's sent to members, individualized, but there is currently no dashboard of metrics that is driven by the OPTN board leadership that leads to a report that's built and submitted to them and gets feedback between the board leadership and executive committee and members. So the proposal we have for this group was to create an audit entity that reports member compliance and also does best practice sharing, mentorship activities. It would be in 2 teams. It would be a data analysis and reporting team, and it would be an OPO outreach process review, best practice review, standard operating procedure review, and dissemination team. That portion of it was a very popular concept amongst people involved in this group, and I'm from an outside group. Both from of the OPOs that were involved thought this was a very good concept and one that had been needed for a long time. We've heard from folks on the Patient Affairs Committee, from the board leadership, and from the MPSC. They were all very supportive of this concept. And then there's a collaboration part with OPTN members and the executive committee. Essentially, the kind of proposal is this would be reported to the OPTN executive committee and the MPSC. These reports would be, and they would also be generated, and then feedback would go back to centers, OPOs, especially those that either needed some improvement or were showing excellence in some of those metrics. And obviously, those that are showing excellence would be, they would be seeking some answers as to how did you achieve these excellent metrics with respect to, it could be allocation out of sequence, or it could be any other number of activities that the board leadership would determine was important to be under review. There would be a number of implementation resourcing considerations. There would be staffing, training of members, information sharing, and there would need to be membership policies. OPTN policy would have to be updated to allow these activities. There's already a broad structure for it, but kind of focused on MPSC activities, but it doesn't get into this depth that would need to be done to run an audit activity. Next slide. Okay, now we're going to get into the next steps. This is a kind of combining all 3 groups, all 4 projects, and discussing the ways forward. So the ways forward, obviously, this is just initial concepts right now. We have developed concept papers and submitted those to board leadership. That'll be under these concepts for these projects will be under review by board leadership and HRSA. There then would be a legal review to ensure they meet the requirements of note in the final rule and comply with policy, or we would outline what policy would need to be changed so it would be compliant. And then the meetings are temporarily paused until the end of the month, just pending some of that feedback. We don't want to go drive ahead and do any more work if a project is determined not to be implementable. And then us 3 leads will continue to coordinate with board leadership, HRSA AIR, until we get to a determination on what we're doing for the next steps. Next slide. Yeah, so that concludes, I think, the brief on the 4 projects and the overall briefing on the work group. I'm proud to have been lead on this, and it's been a wonderful experience and working with these dedicated folks. I turn it over now for any questions.
Thanks, Justin. And again, just to remind everyone, this is a overview update to the board just to keep people in the loop of where things are going. It's very much phase 1 of this project with respect to, there's both the various people have different roles in this, the OPOs and the transplant centers. We're going to look at it holistically, but this again is the first step. The plan will be, the work groups have committed this all to a draft on paper, which is actually much easier to look at, and that was just finalized earlier this week, and that will be circulated once it undergoes initial review to the board, and the work group will continue to develop this further out with the eventual goal of developing policy around all this stuff. So, John Hodges.
Good afternoon, all. First, a housekeeping question. I do not see a link on the Vimeo page for the OPTN for this meeting, so I don't think we have any public observers other than public who are part of the board. That's housekeeping. And
I'm getting text. I'm getting text from public members, so I think
we are live streaming, so maybe
okay.
there's
great. I don't know how they're finding it, but the question I have, Justin, do you have uh, proposals or motions that you want us to review? What form is feedback for you?
Yeah, good question. And I figured that would come up. We're not even to that point yet. Right now, we just have very broad concepts, and did want to present to you and to the public kind of the work we have been doing. Obviously, we've now been engaged in this for about 5 months, 6 months, and so we did want to let you all know what's doing. That will come. That public comment period, if these projects are approved, even to move forward. Obviously, there's considerations for budgeting, a number of other considerations. I mean, I believe these projects are important and should definitely be considered, but we're not to that point for moving to the public yet, but did want to update everyone on what we have been doing.
It's just what you just said was that you're pausing meetings pending our feedback. And I just want to know
Yeah.
what feedback do you want?
So the
For the board officer and HRSA initial feedback, and then it's going to go to the greater board and then to the public.
So just, John, to clarify, this was result of a directive from HRSA to the board. The board stood up these work groups. They've been working furiously. This is just an update on that. The plan will be, once we see the, having attended many meetings with nothing written, or, you need a summary statement to kind of get your head around it, or at least I do. So those documents have been developed. I just got all 3 yesterday. We're looking at them just to make sure they both capture the right direction. We'll make sure that we're not going somewhere south on NOTA, and then also think about all the messages to declare, such as this is not a policy proposal. It's just an update. It will go through the normal process. Yes, we have thought about other organs and everything. So there will be, you guys will see this again as a formal document. This is just a verbal heads up.
And I'd add, John, this hasn't even gone through a legal review yet. So before we push
Yeah.
this out any further, we'd want to
Yeah. Yeah. So Andrew.
Thanks, Justin. Can we go back to the definitional slide? I just have a quick question for you about that, Justin, if that's okay. If that's possible.
Talking about the organ offer
They're
definition.
bringing them up right now.
Yeah.
Did you mean the offer definition, Andrew, or did you mean the criteria?
The offer definition.
Can I have the slides back up, please? Thank you. We want to go back to the definitional offer. One more.
So as I read this, Justin, an offer is only an offer if it's given in an allocation ordered OPTN match run. So I guess by definition, there's no such thing as an out of sequence allocation offer now, because it can't be an offer because it's not in sequence.
Well, yes, that's correct. But part of this is we needed an expedited pathway to cover what had been allocation out of sequence before, which is the other proposal, kind of marrying this with the other proposal. So you ask a very good question, is okay, if not that, then what? And so that is part of the concurrent time limits project. If we get through concurrent time limits and there's still not an accepted offer, then what? And I think maybe, is that really what you're asking? That's a question we're trying to work through now as part of this project and haven't got to completely there yet.
No, I guess I'm a little concerned that we've essentially defined offers in a way that doesn't allow for out of sequence offers, that they're out of sequence something else. And then how do we handle that? That's my question.
Yeah, we acknowledge that we will not fully eliminate allocation offers out of sequence. And we also acknowledge that discards, allocation out of sequence, if necessary to prevent a discard, we understand that. What we're trying to do is reduce it dramatically.
Agreed, but they're not offers. You just said out of sequence allocation offers, but by definition, those aren't offers.
Okay, yes, I understand that, but we're just saying we know that out of sequence is never going to be completely eliminated.
Okay, maybe we need a different terminology for what those are then, if we're not going to call them offers. Thank you.
Sorry, I was on mute, Jen.
Yep. Justin and Kevin and Dr. Potter and the rest of the people that are involved in this, I just wanted to say thank you guys for the due diligence and time that you have put into this in just the short period of 5 months that you guys have devoted to this. Obviously, you're trying your best and starting with kidneys and knowing that you're going to work your way into all the other organs that are involved in this. I really appreciate your efforts and that I can clearly see that you're trying your best with all of this, and that clearly there's a lot of hard work and time that you're putting forth in this. So I appreciate that greatly with all of this, because I know there are a lot of organs in there, and we don't want to see any discards taking place in this effort. So thank you guys for all of that and your time and everyone involved in this.
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate it.
Yep.
I believe Sarah's next.
Yeah, I just thank you, and thanks to all of you for this discussion, and especially thanks to the work group and the leads, both Justin and Kevin, and also Steve, who's not here today. This group has done an incredible amount of work, and we're really pleased to be collaborating and to be supporting this effort. And I want to take a second to appreciate that. I also wanted to chime in on the question of this offer definition that's on the screen. Your point is well taken, that as written here, an organ lowercase o offered to a patient out of sequence does not meet this definition. I think it's sort of you could call it definitional or tautological, a question of whether that kind of AOOS behavior would constitute an offer according to policy language is not, I think that is less critical of a question than the question of whether that action is happening at all. We can say like, oh, that is not an offer because it doesn't meet this definition. Or if this definition were changed, you could say that is an offer that is non-compliant with policy. I think in either case, what's critical about this definition is identifying what constitutes a formal, like what is necessary to constitute an offer, so that we can identify cases where, I got a text message, oh, that doesn't count.
Thanks, Sarah. Jerry.
Thank you, John. Just an excellent presentation. I had a question. So in December, the New York Times reported on transplant tourism that's continuing to happen in the U.S. and centers recruiting patients for $2 million and more to come here and get transplanted. It would seem that in order to do that and get the organs, they're using allocation out of sequence. And I'm wondering if you looked at that or observed that in your review.
Justin, I can handle that. Jerry, I'll be giving in the agenda there. I don't know if it was on the agenda for how in depth it was, but there'll be a update on that component of things, the non-citizen, non-resident transplants. That looking at that is part of what we're doing, but we haven't gotten that far yet. So where those
no, I understand. I understand. I was curious if Justin and in looking at it, if that issue came up.
No, it didn't. Jerry, to be honest with you, we didn't discuss it. It didn't come up, and that whole article kind of came out late as we were moving towards the end of this.
Do you think if centers are doing that, they're doing it through allocation out of sequence?
I don't know. Okay. I don't know. I mean, we had to. Well, I don't know whether those offers are in sequence or out of sequence. I'm not sure, Jerry.
The article, when it talked about that single heart recipient that was highlighted, she was quite high on the list. It didn't seem consistent with AOOS. I think it was more how she was listed, but certainly we don't have the detail.
Yeah, and we will, Jerry, to your point, we will look at that as well as several other things that are there. But the allocation out of sequence work was really focused on the broader system rather than specific single patients. Andrew.
Justin, I have just one other follow-up question for the compliance work group. So has there been any discussion of how to audit or review decisions that the physicians are making when they're allocating an open offer? So somebody gets a out of sequence allocation offer, and then the physician decides it's most appropriate for someone 180 spots down their list, right? So I understand that there's a focus on the OPO's move to allocation out of sequence, but there's this other half of it of how the physician is deciding who on their wait list is getting the offer.
Yeah, so we'd had discussed those situations and acknowledge, I think there are circumstances where it probably could go in this altered offer system that we're talking about here with the clocks. But we understand, we do acknowledge that there are cases, you could look at logistics as being part of it, or cold ischemic time, or a number of different things where centers got to make a fast, quick decision and get before the organ becomes a discard to save a patient, to save an organ. So we discussed those things. We don't have a good solution for all that, to be honest with you, but there's going to be at the end of these projects, there's going to be a set left that we're going to have to probably figure out policy on. We haven't resolved that. What we're trying to do is resolve the lion's share of this problem. And then the subsequent project would be, okay, now that we've done this, we've evaluated these programs, what is left that we need to make sure is included either in the expedited pathway that isn't, or that is out of sequence that we either have to accept or find a way to, resolve it.
But to your question, Andrew, we will, that's, I don't know if it's the lion's share, because I'm not sure we know what are the total shares in this whole practice, but we will be looking at center practices and how it goes down the list, because that is part of it. It's integral to the general overall concept of who gets the organ. So there will be the second part of looking at that. How is that handled within the center? Because once it's at a center, that how that works is different than what we've been doing, what the group's been doing so far. So,
and can I just add to that Andrew, there's some anecdotal evidence that came up during this group's work that we had some in-depth discussions with an OPO that dramatically lowered its allocation out of sequence without negatively affecting its discard rate, and it did it through organizational practices and standard procedures with its member hospitals and transplant centers. So we believe that there can be an impact on this to a certain extent through that kind of mentorship and information sharing and OPO management practices.
Jim.
Yeah, I received a kidney transplant on October 28th, and the kidney fits this definition of hard to place because it had cancer and it had a blood disease. My doctor called me up. He said he was a specialist in kidney cancer, that he had taken the cancer out and could address the blood problem. If under this new system, if it's implemented, and you had, say, 3 yeses, is there any discussion of who best among the doctors of the hospitals could handle this? What if this kidney had gone to a hospital that didn't have the expertise of my particular doctor? Is there any way that could be handled under this new proposal?
That's a great question. And so we didn't get into depth on this, but part of this proposal is in order to let's say, accept and go into the concurrent or system and to accept or the concurrent clocks to accept an organ, you would have to opt in, meaning you would have to have a decision that you have the expertise to transplant those organs. You still have the opportunity, just like you do right now, to individually assess an organ against a patient in the match run. So I don't think it changes anything. It's just making the decisions for multiple centers happen concurrently, but it wouldn't change a center's decision on whether they could accept it for you. And I don't think it would encourage centers to accept organs that they shouldn't, that they don't have the expertise to transplant.
Yeah, my doctor said he took it because he didn't think the cancer could come back maybe for 10 or 20 years. And I'd only been on the list for 6 weeks, and he dropped way down and gave it to me because he said ethically he couldn't give it to a younger person who might have been higher on the list, because if the cancer came back, he'd be doing harm. So that's my particular situation. And I'm just wondering, because of the expertise, if there had been sort of a competition among 3 yeses, we would like it, whether the person with a better track record, he had done 5,000 transplants and lots with kidneys. Is there any way that could be taken care of in this new system?
I think that would be hard to operationalize, but we can certainly think about it, and we'll record it for the going forward, because many of us are experts at everything, and that doesn't mean it's true. So I think that figuring out a good way to do it reproducibly and fairly, it's a great idea, but I think we just have to think about how to operationalize it, but we'll incorporate that idea.
That's a wonderful story, James, and is probably a model of what would fit into this system. and where an organ like that may have been discarded in the past would hopefully be transplanted in the future, not just to you, but to others that need it. That's great.
We're going to start. We have to move. Darren had his hand up before I decided we're going to move. Sam, just send us your comments. Darren.
Yeah, thanks. Just to echo the sentiment that, at present, just to add to the anecdotes, I think, the majority of the time, and again, this is just one experience, but there are circumstances where logistics play a role. The physician's expertise and understanding of the patient indicates that somebody more suitable for that organ, and without putting it at risk of discard, is an appropriate allocation outcome. And there should be a parallel consideration for how that's baked into the system. And we want to be careful to also consider those coastal DSAs or locations where geographic isolation plays a huge part in whether or not you can safely move organs from one place to another. At present, if the center decides to transplant into another recipient other than the one that was initially indicated, is that currently baked into the system? Is there a mechanism for them to do that? And as we consider what this looks like in the future, will this system also allow for that to happen? So I would agree with the sentiment that there needs to be some mechanism for us to, and not too far down the road, but there needs to be some mechanism for a center to indicate that there was a more appropriate candidate for that organ, and that with the after working with the OPO to determine that to do otherwise would put the organ at risk of discard, that it was an appropriate outcome.
Yeah, thank you for that, Darren. I'll just say these are things we are considering. And when you look at the selection criteria for this simultaneous clocks program, it would be OPO centric, obviously, where that organ was located, where they would. So these geographic considerations are taken into account. I don't have the specific details. We haven't drilled down that far, and these are just initial concepts. But your concerns are noted and have been discussed and are really very important.
Yeah, these considerations, they're being considered even further down the process. So I think there will be, all these issues will be addressed. This is kind of the first bite of the first top of the problem. So the plan will be, thanks to everyone for their input. The allocation out of sequence work chairs will regather, listen to things while we're looking at the actual documents that are on paper. Once they undergo a preliminary review, they'll be shared more broadly for more input. And again, this is more just an effort to make sure the board sees progress as it goes along, rather than getting something that's fully baked and hatched. So hope to make this be a more effective process rather than giving something that's 2 years from now. So thanks again to Justin, Steve, and Kevin, as well as all the people on the committees. So our next agenda item is we're going to have Toby is going to give us an update on the modernization activities as it relates to kind of where we stand in the process. Brianna.
Thank you so much, John. And I just want to again thank everyone with the AOL West work group, all of the volunteers. The OPTN is an extraordinary example of volunteerism and dedication to a mission. So thank you all for the work that you're doing, that you continue to do. And I'm excited to see you all try this new iterative, more rapid development process. We're learning things together, but I love the excitement from people saying, this is what we need, and we don't need it 3 years from now. We need it soon, and we need to think about it together and come up with solutions. So you can go to the next slide. John, if I can just get a verbal, like a time check, because I can't always see the chat or the hands, but if AR team could just let me know when I'm getting close, because I think we might be behind schedule and I want to keep it moving for you. So today we're going to talk briefly about the OPTN modernization, our plans, some key accomplishments, continuity, and the road ahead. Keep going. So OPTN modernization, you all have seen, some of you are logging into lots of places to hear this. Some of you are hearing it for the first time. For those of you on the executive committee, I'm going to go through some of the same slides, but again, repetition is also how we, can be aligned and work together and make sure we're all on the same page. OPTN modernization was really driven by extensive congressional oversight, extensive discussion within the greater community that something better was possible. And with a change in law, this is what kicked off what we needed to do here. And we knew that we needed to update the old operating model that, again, was designed at the time. And we have a person on this call who is a key component of designing what happened with NOTA originally. But this is really about taking a system that does have an incredibly important purpose and bringing it into this century, bringing it into this decade and the century, and making sure that we could deliver results for the OPTN. And we really did want to ensure that the new system, the OPTN system itself, was not just change for the sake of change. This was driven by known and documented deficiencies. This was driven by Congress finding things. This was driven by you all in the community saying there is something here that's not happening. We need something better. So you can go to the next slide. The OPTN modernization components are really broken down into these broad areas: technology, data and analytics, governance, operations, and innovation. You can go to the next slide. HRSA and its oversight extends across the OPTN through the component parts of the OPTN, the contracting, and overall provides for the ongoing, the continuous service of the OPTN as a public-private partnership. Someone I very much respect just recently said to me, he used a more colorful metaphor, but he said, "Brianna, there is great concern within the community. Can HRSA achieve this? Can HRSA do this?" And the answer is that we have to be accountable and say that the former iteration of HRSA may not have had enough people, the right folks with the right skills. But they were incredibly hardworking, incredibly dedicated, but they also needed time and resources. And that's why you've seen a lot of new folks, including myself, join the Division of Transplantation. So really and truly, modernization does have to start with us because we have this incredibly important role. You can go to the next slide. So we are building this out through phases. Phase 1 is, again, changing HRSA, that big line at the top that HRSA's programmatic oversight and stewardship extends across the network itself, the members, the contractors that provide for the ongoing function of the OPTN. That's a big job, and it takes people in the right seats, doing the right work, and with the right skills. And we are really, really proud of the team that we have built here, including Dr. Lasky and the new data and analytics team, which Dr. Lasky and I stood up together. And now she's moving that team in a fantastic direction. But we've grown. Phase 1 was really, can we build out that infrastructure inside of government to help this program be the best it can be. Next, establishing independent governance, assessments of the system, and modernizing operations. And finally, implementing a modern, competitive, multi-vendor system. You can go to the next slide. So again, being accountable. Can HRSA do this? Well, and between 2023 and 2024, the Division of Transplantation and HRSA, the leadership of HRSA invested a lot in bringing in external expertise and doing stakeholder feedback sessions, gathering information, bringing in people together to talk about what is the current state of the OPTN, what is the current state of the services provided to the OPTN, do those services match the needs of the patients, providers, members, and the network. And that gap between what was being provided and what patients, providers, members, and the network needed is really where we can make the biggest difference. But we had to start again with ourselves. You can go to the next slide. Phase 2, independent assessment and modernization. This board is here because establishing the OPTN itself as something separate from the previous nonprofit entity that kind of wholly covered the OPTN. It was synonymous with this other entity, right? But the legislation clarified the OPTN is different than the contractors who run it. The OPTN itself is a public-private partnership. It is not bound by either the services, the skills, the vision of any one contractor. It is now clearly its own independent entity that is supported by a new board support contractor, AIR. And then again, these incredible discovery task order assessments that I hope some of you have had time to read, that have been posted to the new website, where we looked what's current state, what's possible, what are different views, right, that are not constrained by, Darren, I think you and I talked about this one time before recently, but that's the way we've always done it. Bitwadi is something that we all are familiar with, I think, within the context of organ procurement and transplantation, moving out of Bitwadi and into what's possible, what are new, fresh ideas. What if people say, you know, if I could wave a magic wand, what would I change about safety? What would I change about policy development? That's what the discovery contracts were intended to do, and to bring forward a lot of ideas. Not that all of those are the right ideas, or the right ideas at the right time, or that the board thinks they're the right priority, but get fresh looks into a system that had kind of calcified in one direction. Again, serving patients and providers, but is there something more that we could do to help them both get the transplant they need, or help their patients more quickly, you know, use their time more efficiently, more effectively? You can go to the next slide. And finally, phase 3, implementing a modern structure. This is really important because creating a multi-vendor system goes back to, I think, again, that person who I respect saying to me, can HRSA do this? I have an answer there, and it's something I didn't realize when I came into government about 1.5 years ago. But government functions in large, in many, many ways, and in large part through effective contracting. And in fact, there was recently a publication in Nature that reviewed really incredible, again, this is my favorite part of it, the data around, you know, federal contracting, federal procurement, right? So I know that gets confusing, but procurement in this context, meaning the acquiring goods and services, the government acquiring goods and services for a program or for some kind of a task. Like there's a ton of procurement data. And that paper in Nature identified 100 million contracts that the government had awarded between 1979 and 2023. Contracting is something that the government does well. I didn't know when I walked in that it would behoove me, and it would behoove our team on the HRSA side, to really understand how the infrastructure of contracting works within the federal government. We have some extraordinary contracting professionals at HRSA. HRSA issues lots and lots of contracts. HHS issues many, 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 like on the order of many thousands of contracts. These are things that the government does well. What was unusual in the case of this program, it is unusual to have a single vendor over many decades providing soup to nuts, A to Z, all of the goods and services. So again, modular multi-vendor systems are present in many other aspects of government and in government programs and in places where, again, there's something that the government can step in and fill those needs for a national system. This is something that we know how to do. And breaking apart services, not breaking apart the OPTN. The OPTN is this whole entity, right? This whole public-private partnership. But making these modular service components is not something that people had done in this area yet, but it is something that we do all across government and across HHS every single day. So we also wanted to make sure that as we create a modern, effective multi-vendor environment, again, we are not doing something unusual. In other parts, in other programs, there are multi-vendor environments, and we build out ways in which we make sure everyone talks to each other seamlessly. And in that oversight capacity, we have eyes on everything happening with the contractors, and we make sure that our program gets what it needs. So we're not inventing a wheel. This is a wheel that was invented many decades ago by other programs. We're just replicating that inside of HRSA now. So you can go to the next slide. Some of our key accomplishments in 2025, you know, launching our new website. Several of you are already sending us both kudos, questions. Where's this page? I hope you see our responsiveness there. We hear you. And I know that we're ahead of schedule on that website migration. I know that we had a couple of blips with calculators. We were able to handle those in close coordination with our team, the web team, our data analytics team. We moved really quickly to make sure you all had what you needed. But if you have problems, let us know. We launched the OPTN 411 call line. We expanded the frequency and scope of communications. Data analytics team, very exciting that we are moving things into a cloud-based environment, that we introduced AOS dashboards, the AOS reports, and we received approval for a new ventilated patient form that some of you are actually a part of, providing feedback and supporting us in that way. You can keep going. Next slide. Thank you. Governance, establishing an independent board of directors. That's all of you here. And also directing that all OPOs will designate a patient safety officer. We're very excited about that work group taking off with the OPTN and institutionalizing that safety and accountability structure. Advancing that multi-vendor transition, getting those AOS reports, and then making sure that even though there was a funding lapse that occurred in the fall, critical services kept going, and we did have staff on call. We did keep all of those things going that needed to be done, and we know how to do that. Should anything like that happen in the future, we have a playbook, and we tested it out, and overall, everyone was able to become an organ donor, receive a transplant that they needed, and the critical aspects of the system continued. Finally, I want to call out again one of the fastest OPTN policy sprints in history with the new proposed DCD standards. Those are in public comment right now, ending, I believe, on the 18th. And the new registration fee collection system, moving that from a contractor to HRSA to improve oversight and make sure that in a multi-vendor environment, we can maintain funding for all of those critical services and the innovative services that you all want and desire. So let's keep moving. We did finalize a contract with UNOS for core OPTN operations, including the matching system, and patient safety and committee support is moving to a new vendor in early 2026. I get a lot of calls. We get a lot of emails. I want all of you to hear HRSA say that we took years, not days, not weeks, but years, to understand what a safe, modular, multi-vendor environment could look like. And one of the things that the government is really good at doing is making sure that a national system has what it needs to continue. And I can't speak to confidential negotiations, and I very much appreciate people sometimes tell me that the OPTN, the phone wires light up. Like you can see like a piece of, a nugget of gossip or information or misinformation comes through and it sprints through the ether. I think that's because all of you care so much. You care because you're a patient waiting. You care because you're a patient who received. You care because you're a provider. You're trying to do this work every single day. I appreciate the fact that latching onto those pieces of information is probably in all good faith, just trying to find out more. But truly, when we contemplated what needed to happen, understanding the discovery sprints, understanding what Congress had made very clear with statutory change, we had plan A, we had plan B, we had plans C, D, E, F, G, and H. So we are in a bridge period right now. I can't speak more to the contours of those negotiations, but you all should know that we had other plans in place. We are in the plan we're in right now because we knew that this was a possibility and we were ready to spring into action should it be what was needed for the OPTN. And although there is no longer the incumbent contractor supporting the MPSC, those patient safety activities have continued smoothly. You all can still submit a patient safety portal report. Those are all being triaged immediately by a team. And we have follow-ups, acknowledgements, all of those things are rolling out. But that work continues. Reporting allegations of misconduct, many of you reach out to us. Thank you. First of all, thank you for caring enough to reach out. If you see something, say something. The the allegations we get, we triage them, we provide them to the right place where they may need to be investigated. Sometimes that's HRSA, sometimes that's somewhere else. And then the call center is up and running, and you all are calling it, you're using it, and we're glad that you do. We will continue to maintain strong oversight, and we are going to continue to expand our internal capacity, because this program needs a lot to make sure that we're doing the best we can for patients every single day, and that we're innovating. We're ready for new solutions. We need to update the way that we do this work to be in the year 2026. And there's a lot of things we can do together to make it better for you. So next slide. The road ahead. We will continue to transition to cloud-based modern OPTN technologies. We're going to refine those public dashboards, improve oversight, safety reporting, include all of you and the greater public in modernization efforts, build new tools, and ensure that the contracting of the OPTN looks like contracting in other parts of government, where it goes smoothly, it goes well, and it is just a routine part of the work. I hope that one day contracting is not so much on the OPTN's radar, because we have developed this modular system where transitioning a contractor in and out isn't any kind of even really something that you think very much about, because everything is safely contained within the OPTN. It is government owned in the ways that we can all agree upon are very important, so that the vendors come to you to make your work in the OPTN exactly what it needs to be: seamless, easy, dedicated, and you're paying attention to the issues at hand instead of these larger kind of arcane parts of government contracting. So last slide. Thank you to you all. If you have questions, please do let us know. And that's the end of my presentation.
Great. Thanks, Brianna. I think everyone here is very committed to the idea of continuing to modernize and improve, as has been discussed for some time now. I think it's important to recognize, December 29th came. That's when contract ended. There's a lot of reasons about things that HRSA can't disclose to us. There's been a lot of uncertainty, and we've kind of been navigating this together. The board the board officers aren't hearing some secret things that you guys are not hearing. I think this is a transition, and it's both the transition we wanted to happen, and we're finding ourselves in a bit of a gap or a bridge. It's a little useful to think about it, or I like to think about it a little bit like the lapse in federal funding we had earlier. There's stuff that continues that Brianna touched on. There's lots of stuff to clarify in this position where a lot of moving parts are. There's both misunderstanding who did what, who was responsible for which. Miscommunication happens. Somebody can say something that's not true. So I'd urge just at least a little bit of equanimity before when diving into questions. That if the phone doesn't ring on if the phone doesn't get answer on the second ring, it might be they're on the phone to somebody else. But we'll continue to hold each other accountable. It is important to recognize the system for listing and matching patients has continued to run just as it did in the federal shutdown. Patient safety, as Brianna said, they get both the inbound reports, and that is reflected or sent to MPSC, which continues to review things. So there's appropriate oversight from the OPTN volunteers. In addition, things like the DCD work group, the allocation out of sequence, NRP, all continue. DCD is a good example where the OPO committee, which forwarded it, those public comments will come back on the 18th. There'll be a review of those public comments through the standard mechanism, and we will continue to meet, and that OPO committee will meet as needed. Brianna has previously used the term lift and shift, which I think is one way to think about it, especially in the situation we are now, which is that all the standing committees that are not board committees will be ported over to the new system. That includes gathering the information from the previous contractor is available, and that's being put on a secure website, as Brianna said, for everyone to use, and they will be opened back up. So this is akin to, or at least I like to think it's akin to the federal lapse in funding. I think there are many different ways this could have gone, but as Brianna said, there were definitely some contingency plans. And I think the long arc of history will tell us what this was about and how it worked and the challenges. So I think it's just we all wanted to modernize, and change is really hard, and it's a system with lots of moving parts. So James.
Yeah, Brianna, thank you very much for that presentation. It's just a suggestion, if it's not already being done, that your public-facing dashboards have an option for Spanish. There's 40 million Hispanics in the United States, and I think they need to be able to see what we're doing and how successful we are and bring up any problems.
Thank you for the feedback, Jim, and I will flag that for our wonderful Deputy Director of Communications, Ashley Roberts. But I appreciate you very much bringing it forward, and I will follow up with her.
Thank you,
Sam.
I just had a question. I know, and I've asked a similar question about public comment. Is this how you envision it moving forward, or is this a transitional? I just noticed they're being batched every 7 days to 2 weeks rather than every day being able to log in and see new comments and potentially have some back and forth. They're not really, there's been nothing since January 9th, and then the public comments are going to close on Sunday. So I just don't know whether we're going to see any more comments before it closes, or when a batch gets posted that might have some really important information doesn't get posted till the comments are closed.
And Sam, to clarify your question, because I know this was discussed on the EC, but it really has to do with the turnaround time between the submission and the posting. So you're saying that because it's batched, people might not be able to build on each other the same way. I wanted to clarify the question, but Brianna can answer.
Sure, that's great feedback, Sam. We will take that forward. Again, there's no shadow in the corner. This is simply a function of porting information from one place to another. And again, I hear you. I hear that feedback. We'll continue to talk with the web-based team about the turnaround time. I do think, overall, just like with federal public comment, this is fundamentally a space for people to be in conversation with the OPTN, not necessarily with each other in the same way. I do understand what you're saying, but I just think that that kind of contour of this is a person or a group speaking to the OPTN. It's not really built for like the intricacies of like a back and forth, but we will see what we can do to speed up that batching. And I don't want to say, what is possible with the web updates in the future. You should expect this is going to be a great website. And if we can decrease that turnaround time from submission to posting, we should do it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Other questions from the board? Kim.
Sorry if this was I don't know if it was, apparently my camera's not on. Anyway, sorry if this was I was answering a page and I may very well have missed this, but is there it seemed to me that just the communication part of this whole late December thing was more than a little disastrous, and we're the sort of the face to our OPTN community, to our transplant community, and the amount of panic that was ensued by people in committees, and then the committees just that not having support, it really created panic. And I just think, is there a way we can communicate this better? Can the board be a part of the communication, because we're the ones that people then kind of come to? And I just think we as a whole, HRSA, OPTN board, all of us could benefit from just communicating to the network and community a little bit better. All we would have had to say is, there's a gap in contracting, everything's covered, it's going to be fine, we're still going to have SRTR data available to the community, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
I hear you. That is a great suggestion. I will say, I don't think anyone in the community should anticipate a transition like this again. That's not ideal. That's not what you all should think is the norm moving forward. So I want to just caution that I understand fully accountable. We should do those things better. And also, we should not index for this kind of transition happening in the future, because this was unusual. And this is also something where we're going to take back, we're going to do an after action for the HRSA team. I can't speak to the incumbent contractor. That's a separate process. But for us, we appreciate that feedback. We did send out some bulletins, but I hear you that they did not meet the need that you all had. And again, finally, just to land that point really well, please do not extrapolate from this transition what any other transition will look like. This is different.
Yeah, and I think that's true, but I also think that, Kim, your point is well taken. I think some of it's what can we say, because we don't know necessarily what is going to happen. And, you know, I think that the after action plan that Brianna and we've committed to, the HRSA and at least the officers have committed to discussing several things in the history of the recent history about things that could be done better. So I think, again, a little bit more advance notice. It's also at times hard to appreciate, you know, will the SRTR data still continue to be available? It's like, well, the SRTR data is under a separate contract. There's so many things that, like, of course it wouldn't be touched, but people's fears of, you know, the natural fears of uncertainty and everything that's happening.
Right.
You know,
I mean, all that people saw was that the support people were all quote unquote fired, right?
Yeah,
and there was no
yeah.
one to take their place. And so everything gets extrapolated, and
Yeah.
it caused a lot of unnecessary panic, in my opinion. And I just wanted to voice that. And I think we can definitely communicate the message better so the panic could have been avoided.
100%. And I
as
think,
board
again,
members, I think we would benefit from knowing a little bit more ahead of time, maybe that we could help with the messaging. Just so it's not on it's on all of us, not just a few people.
No, we have certainly made the effort to message that too, and with respect to even us knowing a little bit ahead of time, more than because if you find out in a very short term notice, one of your partners has read the email quicker than you saw the heads up email. So we're just trying to, again, have more advanced notice so the board and can be effective messengers of what's happening too, because I do think the potential is there. We just have to make sure we have a good plan to execute on. All right. Well, thanks, Brianna. As updates come along, again, I view this as a short-term bridge, and we plan to, you know, the critical functions. It's hard to always define what are the critical functions, but patient safety and matching and allocating are clearly some of the most critical parts of things we do. That will continue, and the other critical functions that we do will be brought back up up to speed in the next short period of time, is my hope. So stay tuned. So with that, any other questions, please feel free to send them in. So the next, I'm just going to give a brief update on some slides. We are going to move to closed session here shortly for the MPSC, but just to give the board some quick updates. One, as everyone will recall, the board with input from the lung committee provided us input on the continuous distribution policy in response to concerns about logistic complexity. That was approved by the board in November or December. And we've written a letter to we've drafted a letter to the contractor for the IT system to make these changes. It's undergoing some legal review right now, but we hope to have that out. The lung committee also looked at whether or not there was a need to change the way the exception mechanism works. It turned out that's not true. The NRP work group continues to meet. This is a good example of a work group that had previously been supported under the previous operation contractor. It's been ported over to support by AIR and HRSA in the short period of time. The plan there is to have something similar to what you saw today for the AOS thing ready in about 30 days with both a presentation as well as some written documents. The bylaws and management and membership policies work group has been stood up. It's had its first meeting. The second meeting is coming up. The board members on that work group are Shelley Hall, Ken Chavin, Jerry Mandy, John Spurzell, and Kim Wyatt. And they're going to take a look at the high level at the OPTN bylaws, updating them, make sure they continue to are aligned with all the laws as well as new laws, final rule updates, the Secure OPTN Act, and other components of things. They will also begin looking at the rest of the bylaws with respect to how structure works. And they will be routed first through the executive committee, which will make sure they're kind of on board, and they'll be then brought to the board. And the way the bylaws work is not only does the board have to approve them, but actually the entire membership of the OPTN does too. So there'll be a lot of discussion and socialization of those changes. The executive committee met earlier in the week, or actually, excuse me, last week, and there were 3 proposals that were reviewed, previously discussed here, and were advanced to the project stage. Again, those are not that's not policy or even public comment. It's just those committees, once the committees are able to resume work, those projects will begin to be discussed. And then finally, the last issue I want to give a brief update is on international transplant practices. Next slide. Thanks. So this is just a brief update on where we stand with this. Next slide. So as everyone will recall, Mandy had pointed out that in December 2025, the media report raised concerns regarding transplantation of non-citizens, non-U.S. residents, and the allegations in that report included disproportionate number of transplants at of these small number of patients at U.S. centers. There were concerns raised about how this impacted equity, prioritization, public trust, whether or not allocation out of sequence was a factor, etc. So in response to this, the OPTN board leadership, along with HRSA and the contractors, met and discussed things and initiated a coordinated review to ensure, or launched beginnings of a coordinated review to ensure policy compliance and transparency. There's next slide. The report both mentioned that this was occurring, as well as potentially things that would be of concerning, such as allocation out of sequence being preferential. As one example, another is that the OPTN policy basically says is silent on a lot of it, but you can't have a contract with a foreign government as part of this. So the first step in this was to launch a data request looking at transplants from 2013 to present. That we've been defining both what the non-citizen, non-resident is, and listings by and transplants by year, center, and organ. And that data is being finalized, or it's being finalized. In addition, we're adding wait time, urgency, time to transplant, exception use, the allocation out of sequence components of things. Additionally, the board leadership requested MPSC specifically look into specific cases where there might be violation of OPTN policy 17, which is what governs the non-advertising, kind of the transplantation of non-citizens, and look for other instances where there might be violation of other policies. And as they go through that request to these to various programs that are identified as engaging in this practice, they're also looking for any potential. They will be looking for any policy ambiguities or enforcement gaps. And we also undertook a landscape scan to look at what several other countries do. And the Foley Hoag team, which, as everyone will remember, is our board support legal team, has looked at Australia, Britain, Canada, France, Italy. Doug, what is
Spain.
Spain. Okay, UK and the UK. So chosen somewhat at random, but they were kind of our peers that looked at both volumes and some similarities to the United States. So in early, in looking first at exactly what was the policy, the our current OPTN policy does permit transplantation of non-citizens, non-residents. There are other components of the policy, such as I mentioned, you can't engage in a contract with a foreign country for this practice, but the transplantation itself is allowed. The peer countries generally do not prohibit transplants for foreign nationals, and there's a limit to access through residencies, citizenship, or eligibility for payment. And obviously, this whole issue is raising questions about equity, making sure this practice is transparent, and the use of any potential use of exception use or other ways to get around the system, in addition to just the practice itself. So, next slide. We've stood up. Our plan is to develop once this bridge period that we just talked about is closed. We're going to establish a small work group, including members of the Ad Hoc International Relations Committee, to take a holistic look at this. They'll both review current and transplantation policy within the OPTN related to non-citizens, non-residents. They'll assess whether this policy and its intent aligns with actual practice. There'll be some definition of the scope of these candidates, the people that travel to the United States or in the United States for reasons other than transplant, and patients that clearly just and came to the United States for the purpose of transplantation. And they'll finalize the data analysis and MPSC assessment. And then once that is carried out, that work group will report its findings to the board and present options for either clarification of policy, monitoring, enforcement, or development of new policy. Next slide. So I'm happy to, Jerry.
Thanks, John. Thanks for that update. I want to be clear. I think, for at least for me, and I think for others, the issue is not foreign nationals. So it's not, geez, can a foreign national get transplanted or not? The investigation that the Times did and the finding they had is transplant centers offering, they cite one fee, $2 million. It's a very different thing. I don't have a concern about if there certainly would be situations where it makes sense that foreign nationals should be able to access transplants here in other countries. I think what they were reporting is something quite different than that. Do you agree? Is that distinction?
I think they're all important. I think it's both. It's been a while since it's been looked at. There was a change from a longstanding policy, but I agree with you that overall, I agree with both the point about not, as you said, it's been allowed. I think that overpayment, especially if it buys something, or an expectation that you're going to get to go up in line, will be another thing. I suspect the actual costs that are charged and the payment that will probably fall into some other component of government with respect to looking at. But certainly any agreement with a foreign country is a problem. You can't advertise. So I think there are a lot of things that will be looked at in this whole thing. Did that answer your question? Go ahead.
Well, partially. I mean, I just think that, again, the notion that there may be, for various reasons, that it makes sense to transplant someone, just a lot of compassionate reasons, other things. So I think the basic issue of that, can people who are non-U.S. citizens participate in the system? At least my view is yes. And as the author of note, I think that's something we wouldn't have had a problem with. I think what the Times is reporting is something quite different. I think it's people of great wealth and privilege, may not be a country, maybe, who are, and not that they're out there coming to the country to, saying, gee, maybe I can get a transplant in the U.S. in the same way that people here in the U.S. may get on more than one list to boost them. No, this is the centers themselves seeing a revenue stream that they could tap, that they go out and seek that, and then use the U.S. system. And again, I think it's a big deal. I think it's an urgent problem, and the reason it is because of how much our system depends on altruism and public comfort and support of the system. So the notion that people from other countries with great wealth can just come in here and jump to the list, and not only does that happen, but actually some of our transplant centers that we oversee that are members of the OPTN, we're allowing them to do that. And so if there are hospitals that are doing that, I think it's an urgent matter that we get them to stop right away, or they should not be members of the OPTN, in my opinion.
Yeah, agreed. Thank you. And we'll look at all those components. Now,
One other point that that is to consider here when you talk about contracting with other countries, that there are countries like Bermuda and the Bahamas where they do not have a transplant program. And Bermuda, for example, contracts with a center in our region where donors in Bermuda become part of Region 1 donors, and New England Donor Services covers these donors. And then recipients in Bermuda are traveling to the US to get a transplant.
Yeah.
So I think that should be brought up.
yeah,
and just-
we'll look at the whole thing because there are a lot of specifics that we probably won't be able to get through in this discussion. But Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, I just wanted to comment about the money and stuff. I mean, obviously, if people are paying to change their allocation sequence, that's different. But I think the $2 million seems like a lot of money, but that's how much it costs to come to the US and have surgery of any sort, essentially. So, you know, I think house centers, the money seems to me to be largely a way of drumming up concern about it. I think the bigger question is there isn't really a policy about it. And so I agree with everything we're doing. I mean, I think we need to have a policy and have an approach to it that is consistent across centers as opposed to something that varies from center to center. But to me, the money is what it costs to come to the US to have surgery of any sort, really, in terms of the kinds of expensive surgeries that you're talking about with transplants. So I'm not surprised that that's how much it costs. I think the bigger issue is, you know, are they in allocation sequences the way they should be, and do we want to be transport? You know, do we think that that's an appropriate approach? Because I think for a long time the system, the OPTN, has mostly ignored the, you know, what the impact of it.
Yeah, no, I agree. John, the last question too, because we want to move to closed session.
Absolutely. It's a comment on that. I mean, for the vast majority of Americans, $2 million is still a lot of money.
I'm not saying it's not a lot of money. I'm just saying that if foreign nationals who come to the US to have heart surgery, that's what most hospitals want in escrow. And so to me, it's not the money that's the important thing. And in fact, you could argue, I mean, the hospitals will certainly argue that $2 million ends up going back into the system to support all sorts of other things.
Yeah.
But I think the bigger thing is that it needs to be applied really consistently in a way that makes sense and has rules around it.
Agree, and the idea that it doesn't buy something or not. So, but we'll delve into all these issues. All right. Well, with that, Doug, do we have to have a formal motion to move into closed session?
I don't believe we do. What we are going to do though is the team is moving us into closed session, and I will get confirmation once we are in closed session. But did you?
And again, for the closed session is specifically to discuss MPSC peer reviewed protected information.
Great, and we can go ahead and stop the live stream.